for a long time, and it began before I knew him when he had a title for one of his books that came out around the same time as mine. And my brother-in-law will never forget that Mike took the title that he suggested to me and I rejected, or my editor really rejected. So, but Mike has done extraordinary work at Democracy, and thank you to everybody who has supported Democracy Journal. We have an extraordinary panel here today. You can see on the program, I'm going to start with Hannah. So Hannah Garden-Monheit of the Economic Liberties Project, John Halpin of the Liberal Patriot, Zach Moller of Third Way, and Damon Silvers, who did work for 25 years, is that right, at the AFL-CIO?
Actually longer, 27, I think. But anyway, a long time
for the AFL-CIO, and is now not formally connected, but is a senior consultant there. So therefore, he speaks for himself today and not the AFL-CIO. On the way here, I listened to President Trump's comments at Davos, and I won't go into any detail about that, but one of the remarkable things is he couldn't get Joe Biden out of his head. And it went on and on and on about Joe Biden. And it actually was related to both the first question I want to ask and actually the last panel of today. Everyone on this panel and a lot of people in this room have very good ideas about how to make the lives of working people better, and we look forward to hearing them. But I wanted to begin with that tricky, will they notice question at the end of the title of this panel. During the Biden administration, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the real incomes of people at the bottom of the economy rose sharply. And the second highest rate of growth came in the next quintile. So there was a lot of real income growth for working people in the country. The IRA, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Acts all created well-paying jobs for people without college degrees. A lot of them, as working studies and others have shown, in parts of the country that had been left behind economically. Yet working class and very few working class, middle class Americans felt a sense of improvement in their lives, or so it seemed from the polls in the 2024 election results. So I want to ask everyone here, what went wrong? What are the lessons here? And Hannah wrote a whole report on this. And so I'm going to start with her and then just go down the line on that question. Hannah, it's great to have you on the panel.
Thanks so much, EJ, and thank you to Democracy Journal and to Michael for including me in this event. I'm excited for the discussion today. Yes, so I had the privilege of serving in the Biden-Harris administration as part of my work for the Roosevelt Institute, did a project following the end of the administration to interview over 45 very senior political appointees from the administration who worked in economic policy to talk about our lessons learned and to, with an eye towards really grappling with exactly the question you just asked, EJ. And I think we could do hours, many, many hours on that. I like to think I was a very poor therapist to a lot of former officials who had a lot to say about this. But one of the really big takeaways, I think, is that a lot of it starts with what policies you choose to prioritize and fight for, and how you fight for them. And so we heard, a lot of people remained very proud and enthusiastic of the industrial policy work that we did, of the major legislative enactments that we were able to pass, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. But what we heard time and again as we did those interviews was that we were missing a piece of the portfolio that really spoke to, in very tangible, concrete, and bold ways, the kinds of economic frustrations that working people were feeling in their lives. And so, to give an example that came up in these interviews, right? The Medicare drug price negotiation, huge accomplishment for the administration, something that the left had wanted for many, many decades, was a huge fight on the Hill to get that, and a really huge accomplishment. But then you look at the way the policy is designed, and we're talking about 10 drugs with an effective date that's just come into effect now, right, in an entirely different administration, not within the president's electoral mandate. And it still doesn't disrupt the underlying market structures that give pharmaceutical companies a lot of pricing power and market power. And so, one of the things we heard is, well, how are people going to attribute that to the electoral choices that they made? How can you have a political feedback loop if the effects of what you're doing are so diffuse over time and hard to understand? Contrast that with something like $35 insulin for seniors, right? Something that's very direct, tangible, concrete, immediately tells you this is what we're doing for you. And so thinking about how do we do those kinds of things that they're crisp, they're bold, you can explain them quickly, people can immediately understand what it's doing for their lives. And this is something that I think we've seen, Trump, to his credit, gets this, right? No tax on tips, easy to understand. We've seen Mayor Mamdani gets this, free buses, freeze the rent, free childcare, you can immediately communicate it. And a related piece of that is how you communicate it, right? So often we're kind of halting, we don't want to offend people, we have a lot of norms around who we're willing to call out in the public sphere on the left. But if you want to break through and really reach people in our current information ecosystem, you have to be cognizant of the way that the attention economy works. And so another thing that we heard was that the agencies and leaders who were willing to pick fights that really mattered to working people and that they could understand, and then see those fights through, go out there and explain to people why it is that you're fighting against this giant corporation that's price gouging people, and explain to people why that fight is worth it. So there's a lot more we could say about that, but in the interest of time.
Right, just very quick follow-up question. One of the things that always struck me is, while it wouldn't have had the same immediate stimulus effect, making the child tax credit last for the whole administration or beyond was a very concrete benefit. A lot of people saw it. Do you think in retrospect that was a mistake?
This one came up a lot in the interviews as something that people are still puzzling through what went wrong there. One answer is just what went wrong was Senator Manchin, right? But there are also aspects of the policy design that I think we have to grapple with, right? The child tax credit, we reduced friction in how people received it, but that also meant that some people who received it and benefited from it just didn't even necessarily know that they had gotten it, right? It showed up in their bank account. And, I think a lot of times when your bank account's looking a little better, you attribute that to yourself. And when it's looking worse, then you're starting to think about the overall economy. So I think, and then another aspect of it that people, I think, are trying to grapple with is the fact that it was means tested, right? When it's something that is not universal, you have a narrower constituency for it and a less politically powerful one. And so, thinking about on a policy like that, which was incredibly successful while it was in effect on outcomes, it reduced child poverty by half, which is incredible. But if you were to do that again, think about how would you build in the hooks so people know that they are getting this, they know where it came from, and they've got opportunities to take civic action based on liking the program. So whether that's empowering community groups to help those people access it and then go lobby for its extension, whether it's, kind of hitting you over the head a little bit more that you're getting it. I think all the time about Melissa Morales from Somos Votantes did a great piece in Democracy Journal where she talks about the first Trump administration's economic impact payments, and she talks about her father's hands shaking as he's cashing the check because it's more money than he's ever held in his hands at one time. And that's very different from like a little bit of money in your bank account each month.
He could have signed it in big letters
really
on
big
every
letters.
check too, but
That's
another issue. John, let's just go down on what went wrong with what happened. Granting that a lot of this was very good policy that did not have the political impact.
So first, good to see you again, EJ, and Mike, thanks for having me. I love Democracy. It's a fantastic publication. So I look at the politics of this, and Joe Biden's the only person to defeat Donald Trump. And he did it by saying, we're done with that abnormality and all that chaos. We're going to have a period of normalcy again. And even after January 6th, his inaugural address was very focused on unity. Things are going to be calm. Now, it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic, so it's going to be difficult to deal with. But what happened was, I think, unfortunately for Biden's team, it wasn't normal. It ended up being chaotic. And it was chaotic on immigration and then inflation. And you can say these are outside of his control in some ways, but those were the two things that reduced the political impact of the good policy that was set going out to different parts of the country, good industrial policy, all sorts of ideas that made sense, got overwhelmed by the sense of chaos at the southern border, and then 9% inflation. So, if you're an incumbent government and you've spent north of $3 trillion, and you get massive inflation, you're going to get whacked. And that's what happened. And so, I think and then the second part of his term was consumed by his personality, his age and all of that, right? So then people lost trust in it. And we're in an age of zero credibility for any politician. So you really have to keep your word. You really have to, if you say, I'm going to return to normalcy, you need to not be chaotic. And I think, Joe Biden's a really good person. Old Scranton Joe, you knew he cared about the middle class, you knew he was fighting for them, but it got out of his control. And I think that's why, the larger picture, it didn't work against someone like Trump, Trump is a chaos agent. Biden got rid of him, promised things that would calm down, and they did not calm down. They went off the rails in many ways. And so I think that's the politics of what went wrong. Could it be repaired? Well, you'd have to do it in practice. The next time you get in power, pass more good industrial policy, do things that actually try to help people, and make sure you keep things normal. And it's not just on that. We could talk about the effects of social policy in general. You can't just do good economics and expect it to work. People balance social cultural issues with economics, particularly the working class in America. So I think it's that. I think he promised normalcy, they got chaos, end of story. Maybe that's too simple of a theory, but that's the politics of it as you watched it unfold over the first 2 years.
I don't want to press this, but because I want to go to Zach, but one of the things about promising normality is that you actually need both sides to play, and you are, in a sense, putting your future in the hands of the other party too, because they can create a lot of problems. I think you saw that in the Clinton and Obama years as well, but we'll go on that. Zach, please take up the question.
Sure, absolutely, and thank you, EJ, and thank you, Michael, for having me here. So, what went wrong in the Biden administration? I think two things stand out in my mind. First of all, I don't think we built the things that you talked about at the beginning, from CHIPS and Science Act, from the infrastructure bill, from Inflation Reduction Act. Those things did not get built nearly fast enough. I am actually skeptical of the statistic that we created a lot of good paying jobs. I think we created the pathway for a lot of good paying jobs, but whether people felt that in the moment before they were making up their minds about the 2024 election is, I just don't think that's there. And then on the other side of that, as you mentioned, John, like we had really uncomfortable inflation, really uncomfortable inflation. And whether or not many of us in this room thought it was transitory or thought it was getting better, voters said, no, my prices are too high. And that was something that became a real political killer for the Biden administration, and we have to recognize that fact. So what does that mean going forward? We need to be thinking about, when we are making major policy changes, how can we do the things we want to do faster and more salient? Hannah, you made the great point. This is something that Donald Trump is really good at: a simple, concrete policy, and it's something we're going to need to struggle with on the center left and on the left as we get into further presidential elections. How do you get tight, salient policy, and then how can you deliver on it? And then the other thing is, we have to recognize downside risks. We have to make sure that whatever policies we're pursuing, we're not going to repeat the inflation mistake. We did a lot of policy in the Biden administration focusing on getting the economy back to normal as fast as possible. We over-indexed on learning the lesson from the great the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, the Great Recession. And so it's just going to be different now. We need to recognize that we're in tighter labor markets. We have uncomfortably high interest rates, and those things are going to potentially drive the next moment when Democrats, the left more broadly, has power, and we need to recognize that.
Damon, I've admired your work and your thinking in the labor movement for a long time. And the way this election came home to me in a personal way is my hometown of Fall River, Massachusetts, which is an old labor factory town south of Boston, voted Republican for president for the first time this year since 1924. I always say my town came for, it's a Catholic labor town, so we came for Al Smith and stayed for FDR, and it just continued. I'd like you to talk about, this is a moment when unions are more popular than they've been for a long time, if you judge from the polling. Yet it struck me that there are so many places like my hometown that in losing private sector industrial jobs, they also lost private sector union membership. And I've been thinking that if you look across the swath of places that shifted politically, there are a lot of places just like that. So how did the Biden program fail? Clearly this is a Democratic-leaning place where Biden, with his persona, should have done incredibly well and would have historically. Why did the Biden program not speak to the folks in towns like mine?
Well, EJ, let me start with something you sort of threw into your introduction, because I think it shares a lot of light on the question that is really in front of all of us and will be in front of all of us as a kind of how do we take on authoritarianism, and then hopefully will be in front of us as a question of what do we do with actual political power. By the way, I use the word we. I hate that word in these discourses, but there's really no other way to talk in this context. It always brings up the question of who exactly is we and who is they, right? The people who pay my salary prefer not to be the they in the room. We prefer to be the we. But let's first say, the question that we will have to face is the agenda fundamentally one of, can we restore calm? Can we get back to some halcyon moment that was really lovely if you live on K Street, say in 1999 or 2006 or something like that? Is that the plan? And is that what the American people will vote for? Or is the plan to actually take on the problems that Donald Trump has so successfully exploited? That is the question. And I think the most important—
Aren't they linked?
Aren't they linked? No, they're not. Because the problems Donald Trump has so successfully exploited, and I say exploited, meaning he doesn't do anything to address them. In fact, he worsens them. But those problems are the consequences of the policies that made so many people in New York and Washington so fat and happy in 1999 and 2006. The fact that we need to grapple with in addressing this is the fact that the labor movement, trade unions, has a 75% public approval rating, including a 50% public approval rating among Republicans. This is roughly twice the approval rating of both political parties and of any other major institution in American society. And these numbers have shifted since 2009, roughly, in the labor movement's direction and away from every other institution in American society. Now, I'm here to tell you that that is not true because the labor movement is perfect, right? It's not because we're all saints that is true. In my view, it is an expression of the intense, profound desire among the electorate that the core issues of powerlessness and inequality in our political economy be addressed by their elected leaders. And if you want a second data point to measure that, it's the Economic Policy Institute's wages and productivity graph, whose author, Larry Michel, and current purveyor, Heidi Shierholz, are in the room. And the fact that that graph just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, if that doesn't show you enough, I want to talk to you about numbers from 2024, which have been sort of absent from this conversation. The union vote in the 3 states that we all knew mattered, meaning, and that's where we put our political chips. To the extent the labor movement had like resources to move, the labor movement moved them to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Because despite the pipe dreams of various people, we knew this election was going to be decided there. And by the way, it would not be surprising if the next one was decided there either. In those 3 states where, perhaps accidentally, a great deal of the Biden administration's public investment was concentrated, the union vote, meaning people who were engaged with and participating in a strong civic institution that was connecting them to these policies, the union vote moved toward Harris, from Biden 2020, right? The union vote moved positively in anywhere from 1 to 5 points. As you all know, the rest of the electorate moved the other direction quite significantly. But did this happen in all those places in the South where the Biden administration funded all kinds of stuff, huge amounts of stuff, in the South, in Tennessee, in Georgia, with this, perhaps somebody had the hope that that might have a political consequence, which is your question. In Michigan, in Pennsylvania, when an infrastructure project was opened or a factory was broken ground on, a union shop steward told the men and women who walked into that place with their hard hats on, oh, by the way, do you know why you have a job? Right? It's something called President Biden's Infrastructure Act, or it's something called the IRA, or it's something called the CHIPS Act. That's why you're here. In Tennessee and Georgia, there was no shop steward, and the plant manager of companies like Hyundai and Toyota said to that worker, you are here because this Republican governor got you this job. If the Biden administration failed, it failed in 2 respects. The first is it did not bring the full hammer of the federal government down on employers who violated workers' rights in the South, and therefore got no political benefit from what it did. And the second thing it didn't do was actually tell the American public why their prices were going up, and the 2 individuals who were responsible for that, whose names were Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Instead, there was this kind of vague discourse of, isn't this terrible? Because there was no question that inflation broke the back of the Biden administration politically, inflation plus, sadly, aging. Right? But that inflation was not Joe Biden's fault, nor was it Jay Powell's fault. It was the fault of supply shocks by our deadly authoritarian enemies. And when you're facing that kind of thing as leadership, you define it that way. And they failed to do so. Why? I don't know. Ask Jake Sullivan.
Thank you. By the way, when I said they're linked, I wasn't suggesting that I wanted to make K Street fat and happy. I said the fight for democracy and solving those problems were linked. And
EJ, we understand each other completely.
And I just want to make the point that in a lot of places, those shop stewards were not there anymore because of this decline of the labor movement. I don't want to.
It's not just that they weren't there in Fall River. It's that the new manufacturing facilities in the South, they weren't there.
Right. So one of the, can't we all just get along is the title of this session. And to me, part of that, what underlies that is how do you have productive arguments as opposed to symbolic arguments? If you're going to move forward, argument is good, but a productive argument is important. And what I'd like to do is see if we can have both consensus, and the interesting thing is center, left, all agree on the importance of the working class. No matter one way or the other, everybody says you can't build a coalition for change without a stronger share of support from the working class. Zach, why don't you start off? I'd like to go quickly, if we could. What do you think it would take to improve the lives of working people in the U.S.? A couple of quick ideas, and then I'll go across. There will be a 3-minute drill later in this conference about people's good ideas. But let's just go down the line, Zach, and then John, and we'll just go through.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm not gonna front run my boss Jim Kessler, who is going to be giving one of those 3-minute things. But I will say thematically, it is really, really important that workers in this country get two things. They recognize that their costs are going down. We at Third Way think a lot about these 5 tickets to a middle-class life. Childcare is expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Saving for retirement is expensive. Your house is expensive. And I'm blanking on the last one. But look, we need to be doing everything we can to drive these costs down. And because they've gone up so much faster than inflation. And then on the other side, people need to be building their personal wealth. When you have money in your bank account, you feel more secure about your economic livelihood. You feel more secure to take risks and become an entrepreneur. You feel more comfortable buying that house and knowing that you're supporting your family. Those thematically, costs down, wealth up.
Thank you. Hannah?
I endorse all of that. Costs down and wealth up, certainly. I think you've identified, the primary buckets: healthcare, childcare, food is one where people are feeling a lot of insecurity as well. Utility costs shooting up right now, particularly with more and more AI coming online. And I think we need to go through each of those areas and figure out what is our crisp and direct policy solution, not the 12-point plan to build 2 million houses 10 years from now. What is the relief that we can give right now? And healthcare is one where it seems to me there's so much room right now, and no one is putting forward really bold solutions that tackle the moment for how in crisis our healthcare system is. So I would love to see the left really lean in and be bolder about solutions that aren't just endless subsidies to corporate giants whose profits are getting bigger and bigger even as care gets more expensive and worse.
John, and I'm glad you raised AI, because I think that that is already rising. There was a special election for state senate in Georgia this week where data centers were central to candidates from both Democrat and Republican. So if anybody wants to talk about what AI policy might look like, but John, you don't have to go there if you don't want.
I'll pass on AI policy for right now. Obviously, along with this, I always thought Senator Warren's middle-class squeeze concept before she was senator was one of the best shorthands. You kind of have that with this affordability discussion now, but the middle-class squeeze was an interesting idea because to combat it, you need higher wages and lower cost on the big things. And I think if you're going to focus on this going forward, jobs with high wages is the primary thing. And then I would pick one thing, and Democrats are good at healthcare, and even the Affordable Care Act was great, and they're trying to fight for more subsidies. But healthcare costs are still crushing people, and if you had to pick one thing to help working middle-class people, I would take on the healthcare issue again. I don't think the Affordable Care Act went far enough in dealing with the healthcare pressures that most families face. Housing's an obvious one. There seems to be a lot of good talk and some bills coming forward on that. But I would, jobs with high wages and healthcare would be my suggestion for now.
Damon?
Well, I'm really, I want to almost sort of pick up where John left off and reiterate the 2 points that John made, because I think they're critical, but I'm going to do them in a slightly different way. But I just want to make sure everybody hears me that I'm in 100% support what John just said. All right. Now, because I want to speak about this from a kind of institutional perspective, but although I don't speak for any given institution, For a long time, and certainly when I was policy director of the AFL-CIO, Labor had a policy agenda in broad strokes, right? And that policy agenda was rising wages, right, which requires workers have bargaining power, right? It also requires a higher minimum wage. Nick Anauer is here, who is really the master of making that demand. A higher minimum wage, but more importantly, because a higher minimum wage and full employment, but collective bargaining for everyone. That's one, higher wages in a sustained way. Reverse the wage productivity gap. Secondly, security, healthcare, retirement security, access to education of all kinds, not just higher education, all kinds, apprenticeships, on-the-job training. And third, public investment to ensure that and policies that encourage private investment. But given the giant public investment gap that existed pre-Joe Biden and now has been sort of recreated, public investment to give the United States the productivity push it needs. And by the way, how do you pay for that? You must have a fair tax system. Now, the thing about these 4 points is that they are wildly popular with the American people. They poll in excess of 65%, every one. And the stronger you make the language, the less mushy, the less triangulated, the higher it polls. And yet the Democratic Party, which we are not here meeting about, but is a fact, the Democratic Party runs away from those issues with any punch. Because, with people like, the exception of people like Nick, a lot of funders don't like them. But as a result, as Elizabeth Warren pointed out, that's how we lose elections. So those 4 things, and in particular, John's 2 points, higher wages and the power to get them and keep them, and a real healthcare reform, so that United Healthcare does not decide whether I live or die, or you live or die. Now that's how you win. And you don't water it down based on what you think maybe somebody will vote for in reconciliation 4 years from now. You campaign, you fight for, you advocate for the things that will actually fix the problems. That's what we need to do.
You were nodding a lot, Hannah, on that. I wanted to see why.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that really spoke to me in what Damon said, and that was implicit there, and maybe I would dial it up even further, is that to really change the economic experience of people in this country so that they feel that sense of security, that there is a possibility of having a good life and attaining the American dream, you have to be willing to disrupt the status quo of who holds wealth and economic power in this country. And there's a lot of discomfort with that on the left. And I think Damon's right that a lot of it is downstream from donors and funders and from, the lobbyist ecosystem that is so much of who people in DC hear from. And I think we really have to grapple with that on the left, that if we are really going to deliver for working people, we have to be willing to stick our necks out for them and see those fights through.
You raised Nick. Nick has a series of ideas about how we need to talk about markets built for humans. What's the formal title of it? Oh, it is. I got it right. Okay. I didn't trust my memory. I wonder if anybody wants to take a shot at the issue. There are a couple of questions here that are big ones. One is, what specific policies should people propose and fight for? But the other is the context in which economic issues should be talked about. And we had a discussion with Nick last night where there's a peculiar kind of power of a certain very traditional approach to economics that rules out an awful lot of the things that progressives, broadly speaking, including the center-left, support. Any ideas going down? Let me try you, Zach, on that. Is there a better way to talk about economics generally than people on the center-left have done? Have they been talking almost entirely within the language and the framework of their opponents for too long? Anybody have thoughts on that? But I'll start with you, Zach.
I mean, that's a tough question. Obviously, we're all here in Washington, D.C., in a room full of a whole bunch of people who have college degrees and advanced degrees, and not many of us, have the economic experiences of these people we're trying to help. So we need to recognize that we have to, reset a little bit and listen to a little bit more polling sometimes, listen to a little bit more contradictory thinking, and kind of come back around to these issues in slightly different ways. But, we got to, at the end of the day, so many of the things that we want to accomplish in the broad left of center, we need to make sure what we're doing is in service of those things. So I've articulated, I think we need to bring a lot of costs down and increase wealth. So if taxing corporations and billionaires is a means to that, think about it that way. Taxing corporations and billionaires is not the end goal, right? Building substantially more worker power is not necessarily the end goal. It is a means to get there. So recognizing that, the things we're pushing for are the method to get to broader prosperity.
Damon's got a picture on his phone. I'm scared. What's he going to do with that?
Well, this picture, I just think we just need to remember something as we go through these discourses. This picture is courtesy of my friend and colleague, Mike Pothorzer. I would not have seen this. This is the President of the United States, the current one. You probably can't see him on my phone. Standing in front. Hold it still. Yeah, oh, I see, yeah. I don't know if you guys can see this. It's the President of the United States with a bunch of people sort of, I don't know who they really are, but they are dressed to look working class. And he's standing under a banner that says, lower prices, bigger paychecks. Now, that's real clear. All right? That's real clear. If we want to beat this guy and what he stands for, and I say this not as a partisan thing, but as a values issue, if we want to beat authoritarianism and the utter destruction of the Atlantic relationship that we are being sponsored by, we need to really fully embrace the notion of bigger paychecks, right? And in order to do that, we have to challenge some conventional economic thinking. I'm getting around to your question, right? We really have to. Next thing about human markets, markets are shaped. I spend a bit of time now in my retirement in London with Mariana Mazzucato, who is the economist who stands for the notion that markets are shaped. I was with her yesterday. And if we don't embrace that, which is, by the way, a colloquial way of saying things that John Maynard Keynes said a long time ago, and frankly that Adam Smith said a longer time ago. And if instead we handcuff ourselves to the set of economic ideas that are associated with the notion that history had ended in the 1990s, if we handcuff ourselves to general equilibrium theory in that form, and here I speak slightly technically, if we handcuff ourselves to the idea that history is frozen, that there's no politics, that power doesn't matter, that stability is all there is, if we handcuff ourselves to the ideas that Alan Greenspan told the United States Senate in 2008 as the roof fell in around him economically, oh, by the way, we got it all wrong. If we as a party, I'm not allowed to say that, it's actually not what I think. If the people who are trying to defend democracy in the American Republic handcuff themselves to those ideas, we will suffer the fate of the Weimar Republic. And that is, by the way, why the Weimar Republic fell, was because it handcuffed itself to orthodox economics in the late 1930s. We cannot do that. And I mean, I don't know what more there is to say. I mean, this is a matter of life and death for the American Republic. And we need to take that incredibly seriously.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes. Let me go back to Hannah, if I could. There were 2 points we had an exchange before the panel that you made that I think are really worth elaborating on. One is the role of conservative courts in blocking Biden policies. And they seem somehow a little more eager to block Biden's policies than they do the current president's policies. But that's for another day. But something happened there, and you think it had a real impact. The other point you made, and there is going to be a discussion of abundance, and you raised an interesting way of looking at that, which is, the abundance approach looks at sort of procedural sludge, the word you used to describe this. I don't think they would object to. But you also argue that increasing public input in efficient ways is actually a good thing, not a bad thing in pursuing good policy. Take those 2 points, because I think they're really important in understanding the hole we're in.
Yeah. I think actually your point about the level of scrutiny that administrations get from the courts seemingly varying with the letter by your name is actually the rub is incredibly important. And I think we've seen, what I am a lawyer. I went to law school at a time where we were taught that, the courts are the protectors of our individual liberties and our rights and our core to the separation of powers. And I think folks have been slow to adjust to realizing that that is no longer the case, that they have been heavily captured by a very concerted effort on the right over the last 40 years to stack the courts with folks who are, ideologically very, very friendly to corporate interests. And we saw, we also have a system in which forum shopping runs absolutely rampant. And so during the Biden administration, any trade association or corporate interest could pretty much have a guarantee that if it filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Texas, it could vacate or enjoin it could get a Biden economic policy vacated or enjoined. And so there were, so many policies that I think would have put meaningful economic relief back in working people's pockets that never came into effect because of those courts. And I should say with more precision, because of Trump appointed judges, expanded overtime, a cap on credit card late payments, which, by the way, now we're hearing all about Trump's support for capping credit card interest rates. We're not hearing a lot about when his judge stopped relief on credit card debt from coming into effect during the Biden administration. The ban on non-compete, something I worked on very closely. Student loan debt forgiveness. They're just example after example after example where there are things that would have put billions of dollars back in working people's pockets that never came into effect or saw the light of day because the courts have been so captured. And I think people on the left have been really slow to realize that there is this gigantic veto gate if you believe that the government should rein in markets to make sure that they are operating in the public interest and fairly and competitively and believe in economic regulation of the economy. You've got this huge problem that's not going away unless you really focus on some court reform. And then on the public engagement point, which actually I think ends up being a related point, because our primary tool for public engagement in this country with our government has been the Administrative Procedure Act, which has this very formal notice and comment process that agencies have to go through to promulgate regulations. And then they have to respond to every comment that's in the record. And if you don't adequately respond to it, it becomes the basis for a legal challenge. And all of that, both the comment process itself and the legal challenge, is far more accessible to moneyed interests, right? Yeah. Normal working people aren't combing the Federal Register to see what regulations might affect them in the alphabet soup of agencies and give input. And so I think, the abundance insight that we have too much procedural sludge that slows us down, that gets in the way of focusing on outcomes, I think that's right. But you have to recognize that you can do public engagement in a way that isn't procedural sludge, that isn't this formalistic, you hire a K Street big law lawyer to write to monitor the Federal Register and weigh in for you. You can do things that are actually not super resource intensive, that put you much more in dialogue on a very continuous basis with working people. So on just a very practical level, this was things, there were some agencies that did this well. The Federal Trade Commission, for example, held open commission meetings for the first time in history where anybody could show up and speak their mind about what they were facing. The CFPB and other agencies had complaint databases where you could, explain that you were having a problem and reply. We had open comment dockets to track the economy. We had listening sessions out in the country, not just during business hours in DC. This stuff doesn't have to be.
I think there's a Democracy Journal piece here under the headline "Sludge No, Democracy Yes," because I think there's some interesting place to come to, I think, on that. Thank you for that. John, I want to comment briefly, if you could. You've done enormous work over the years on social democratic and labor parties around the world. And one of the most striking things is that this decline in working class support for parties of the center left crosses virtually every democratic nation. There's been Didi Quo of Stanford came into my class yesterday at Georgetown and just showed this remarkable chart about support for the center left from highly educated people soaring, working class people going down. There's been a switch of constituencies. What lessons can Americans learn from this decline elsewhere? It's not that they are doing all the things right, because they're suffering from the same problems. Look at the vote for the SPD in Germany as a particularly striking one. But go ahead.
Sure. I mean, the short of it is, the lesson is don't do that. And the, you swap the working class for professional college educated class, you're going to have a different sociological base for your party. And what the short story is, their economics moved to the right and their culture moved to the left, and they lost the working class. And that's the Democrats in a nutshell, in many ways, if you look at the numbers among middle and lower income voters and higher income ones. And it happened around Trump. They're now swapped. So, Democrats used to get basically most of the middle and lower income vote, and they don't. And their economic policy in the 90s went pro-globalization, pro-China. Their cultural policies went way left, and they left. And the working class left, and Trump got, 56% of the non-college vote? There was a 22-point shift among black men. I mean, so their entire theory, which is we'll jack up college-educated white vote, keep basically black and Hispanic levels are the same and we'll win, doesn't hold. And they lost everybody to the corrupt billionaire. And it's not everybody. It's obviously you're talking about percentages within. They're still getting a decent chunk of working class voters. But that basic concept, move right on economics and left on culture, is a bad trade. And if you want to have, can't we all just get along? Listen to the populists on the left on economics and listen to the moderates on culture, and you might have a solution going forward that's pro-working class.
Let me go down the panel and make the question more pointed so I can be true to Mike's insistence that we be on time. Efficiency is good for progressives. There is this sort of funny policy disconnect between policy and policy folks and what people in the country perceive the policy is doing. And this has not always been the case. When Roosevelt did TVA, the people in the Tennessee Valley, broadly speaking, understood what was going on. The National Labor Relations Act, Damon,
turning the lights on and have them come on. I mean,
and there was a lot of concreteness. The WPA and was very clear that people understood because of the specificity of the benefit, and the administration actually did a pretty good job of saying this is from this policy. How do you fix that policy, that disconnect between policy and the way people experience it? Because I don't blame the people for that myself. I blame the policymakers and political leaders for that. Maybe I'm very disinclined to blame the people myself. But Zach and Damon, why don't you take that? And then I'd like both of you to close on how do you heal this link between policy and the experience of policy that citizens in our country have? But Zach, go ahead.
So on, EJ, you're asking about the recognition of that we're, could you just restate my piece of it? I'm sorry.
Say again?
Could you restate the question?
There's a gap between the policies pursued in Washington and that people who are interested in policy argue for, and the way people perceive their effect on their own lives. And I think I'm not being romantic in saying there were moments in history when that linkage was clear and people understood this policy led to this outcome, which was good for me. And I don't think you feel that at all in the same way. And I fault the people more here than out in the country for that. And not everybody in this room, of course, is perfect, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, Damon, I really liked what you said. Oh, the lights actually came on. That's a big thing, right? But we had a whole bunch of ceremonies from a whole bunch of policies that we did in the Biden administration. We had a whole bunch of headlines. We're going to bring these jobs here, but I don't think people didn't see them. People didn't experience them because they just didn't roll out fast enough. Right, that is one of the fundamental challenges of policymaking in today's environment. Is you don't get from A to B nearly quick enough. And even in things that we can do really fast, Democrats are incredibly successful at sending people checks in getting money in bank accounts, but like that didn't make enough people happy in a sustained way with child tax credit benefits and things like that to shift it by the time we reached the election. So it's just recognizing what we can do when we need to be doing it, and I think that's the way we need to try to make some of that progress.
Okay, so everybody's got to speak real fast to close. I'm gonna start with Damon, real quick to John, and Hannah will close for us.
All right, great, thank you, EJ. Let me sort of, in order, take on a couple of points that I think will help wind this up. There's a deep connection today, if you pay attention to the transatlantic environment, between the issue of, what was it, procedural sludge, the issue of how important is that, right? And the issue of the deterioration of working class support for the traditional parties of the working class. There's a deep connection. You've got to pay attention to what has happened in the United Kingdom over the last year. Yeah. After catastrophic conservative government, the Labour Party swept the entire country, and it particularly swept all of the working class districts that it had lost at various times to the Tories, but not by very big margins. Right? And I was sort of involved in this in a tiny way, and I saw it. People were done with the Tories. This might be the environment of 2028, 2029, by the way. When the Labour Party came into power, they announced essentially a program of economic growth through getting rid of procedural sludge and orthodox economics, tight fiscal policy. The result was they cut home fuel allowance for old people.
Yeah.
Right? It was like putting a knife in the side of the people who voted for them in working class communities. And Britain has more procedural sludge than the United States does. Right? It is an actual social democratic country. It has more of government than we do. And they haven't moved the needle on growth at all. Now, mindful of time, if we're going to talk about liberating supply side, productive capacity, abundance, the people who are really for those ideas in reality are people who make things for a living and build things for a living. That part of the Democratic Party, which the labor movement speaks for, we're way for that. And we're the only people in the party who are. The environmental movement's a little less keen on that. But is that the real agenda? Or is the real agenda cutting wages? If the real agenda is cutting wages, we're talking suicide here. Self-inflicted wounds. And finally, I want to disagree slightly with my friend here to the right. High taxes on billionaires and rising wages are the goals. They are not instrumental because they are essential, as Teddy Roosevelt said, for ensuring that democracy survives and works. However, you and I may disagree, but we have to find a way to unify so that we don't have the republic collapse. So I'm fine having people in the camp who don't agree with me on this point. But you got to agree that you got to do those things in order to win. Let's treat them entirely instrumentally. That's fine, right? But let's do them because otherwise we're going to lose.
We are over time, but I still want to give anybody, Hannah or John, do you want to have a brilliant closing word?
Oh, I don't know about brilliant, but I would say, so I think we should right size our process to get rid of some of the procedural sludge. But one of the things that was really striking to me in doing all of those interviews was that you often can break through the procedural sludge with political capital and political will. And where does political capital and political will come from? It comes from the people. It comes from having the wind at your back of having public support. And that, I think, is the key, that we have to focus on what are the things, what are the lights that we need to turn on for people? Go listen to people, working people, and see what are the things that we tangibly need to be different in your life, and then design your policy around the did the lights come on Damon test of execute it within your electoral mandate, do it fast, and prove to people that democracy can still deliver real, meaningful improvements in working people's lives.
I knew you'd be inspired. So we have done a great thing for our friend Ed Luce, who's moderating the next panel, but, which is you put procedural sludge on the table, which is a perfect lead-in to the next panel. But I also think in some ways turn on the lights is a central theme here when we think about policy. And you need the resources to turn on the lights, and you need the lights actually to go on. Thank you all so much for a great conversation.